This is an overview of the benefit and manner of asking the right questions, and it's a review mostly of Browne and Keeley's Chapter 1. Asking the right questions is a really important concept that relates to our clinical practice. We talk about evidence-based practice a lot in our field, and critical thinking is at the cornerstone of evidence-based practice. So if we don't use critical thinking when we're practicing speech-language pathology, then we're really doing our jobs wrong. Because critical thinking is so important, we need to think about some of the values or qualities that critical thinkers possess. So one characteristic is autonomy, which means being comfortable with yourself to the point that you're comfortable hearing all points of view, but making your own judgment. You also need to be curious, which means to be a good listener and a good reader, and really have this internal motivation or drive to find the answers to some of the questions in our field and that are relevant to you clinically. Also humility, which means recognizing that even you or the smartest person in the world can make a mistake in your reasoning. And that even the most compelling evidence has flaws. So just being open to the idea that you're not always right. And then finally, respect for good reasoning wherever you should happen to find it. Here are a few more aspects of critical clinicians or critical thinkers. There's a way to ask and to answer clinical questions appropriately without being defensive or alienating your coworkers or your clients. If you can engage your sense of curiosity and desire to improve your client's life in such a way that you ask good but respectful questions, then you're going to be a much more successful clinician than if you did otherwise. So it's also important to be able to see the connections between clinical factors that might influence your client's progress, such as home life and school achievement. So wondering about the connections between those things can be a very important part of critical thinking. So these are all skills that critical thinkers need to possess, and it may come more naturally to some of us than to others. So it's a skill that you can build over time. So on the other hand, we can also think about the qualities that non-critical thinkers may possess. And there's really a lot of downsides to being a non-critical thinker or a non-critical clinician. So if you accept whatever you read or hear as a fact, that's really going to influence how effective your therapies can be, because you won't have a good evidence base for your therapies that you may use. Oftentimes, when we don't think critically, we search for sources that support our beliefs instead of having a wider approach to the evidence sources that we look for. Oftentimes, when we're in a hurry and we want quick answers, that's also a component of a non-critical thinker. We may also lack curiosity at times, or we may think that our therapy is working because of this great new technique that we're using, but we might fail to consider other reasons for why therapy is working. And really, sometimes we like to gather information, but we don't use it. So this could happen when you're collecting your session data, as we tend to do, but when you don't actually use the data that you've gathered to make decisions about whether to change up treatment, whether to change goals, and so forth. The other thing is that, of course, if you're not thinking critically, that you could end up actually hurting your clients or patients, especially in medical settings, but certainly you're going to be providing less helpful treatment that isn't evidence-based. One way to begin to answer clinical questions is to use what your authors call the sponge approach, as in you soak up information like a sponge. There are some advantages to this approach, namely that it's easy, you're a passive observer, so it's not hard, you don't have to ask the hard questions or to engage your sense of curiosity. If you're using the sponge approach, you're not at the point where you're using critical thinking. This is a problem because you aren't able to decide which answers you're receiving are the best for your particular client, and you're going to use therapy techniques that don't necessarily have a good evidence base. The panning for gold approach is a step above the sponge approach. It means that you're still soaking up knowledge, but this time you're asking critical questions and reflecting on the answers that you receive. At the beginning of your externship, you were probably taking on more of a sponge approach, but now that most of you are in your second week, you're probably doing more active listening and processing of the information that's being relayed to you. You're starting to do some problem solving, and you're asking additional questions about your job responsibilities and how to carry out specific tasks. So in this sense, you've begun taking more of a panning for gold approach. One of the problems that we may run into is the feeling like there can be a single right answer to the types of problems our clients are likely to experience. But in reality, obtaining a single right answer is pretty much a myth in our profession. As you draw conclusions about what therapeutic approaches you want to take with your clients, it's helpful to ask yourself some questions. Questions like, is there one perfect approach to helping all clients with a certain disorder? Is there one perfect source for information? Is there one perfect approach to helping all clients with a certain disorder? And so on and so forth. The answer to these questions tends to be no, that there is no one perfect thing in any of these areas. So there might be many correct answers depending on the client and his or her personal situation. So we may just decide to forego looking for a single correct answer and simply find the best supporting data for what we think we want to do therapeutically with a client. At that point, we may feel like we're doing our best by our client if we just constantly question whether the things that we're doing are actually benefiting our clients. And if they are, that's probably the actual right answer. Now we can move on to types of critical thinking. Some types are better than others, and as the name implies, weak sense critical thinking does not lend itself to good clinical decision making. When we use weak sense critical thinking, and we all do this, we use critical thinking to defend our own beliefs, and we question others only to really support our own arguments, to support things that we already believe or our own position. And we tend to resist opinions and other people's beliefs and reasoning that's different from our own. On a grander scale, political rhetoric is a perfect example of this type of weak sense critical thinking, where nobody agrees with each other, and it's very contentious. There's no real conversation or dialogue that's taking place. On the other hand, there's the concept of strong sense critical thinking, which requires us to apply the critical questions that we may have to all claims, including our own. This also should be a part of the therapy choices that we make for our clients as well. When we can take this more objective and reasoned approach, it helps to protect us from self-deception and also from making mistakes. So strong sense critical thinking is very important as we continue to develop clinical skills, to refine those skills, and to help a wide variety of clients. It also allows us to maintain a healthy level of curiosity and skepticism. That's a good thing to be a little bit skeptical about the efficacy and the effectiveness of what we're doing as speech-language pathologists. So strong sense critical thinking is what will most likely help us best serve our clients. Here are some more benefits of strong sense critical thinking. First, it doesn't cause us to abandon our beliefs, though it may allow us to sort of solidify and support our beliefs in a very rational way. a way that we could explain to insurance companies, perhaps. There is a chance for continuous improvement when we employ strong sense critical thinking to our own clinical and therapeutic behaviors and decisions. So really being open-minded yet discriminating, or another word would be skeptical, are very important aspects of strong sense critical thinking. Here we discuss some barriers or challenges to critical thinking for SLPs, but also other professionals. First, wishful thinking is a major barrier to critical thinking for SLPs. It often happens that we wish a client would respond better to our treatments without taking critical steps to make this happen. So we may recognize that our client isn't doing well, but instead of actually changing up our therapeutic approach or modifying goals or even referring to another professional, we just sort of wish that they could somehow get with the program and get better. Next, feelings and emotions can get in the way of making evidence-based choices for our clients. For example, we may have a gut feeling that a certain therapeutic approach may work, even if we don't have an evidence base to support that decision. And finally, arguing rarely gets us anywhere if it's not done carefully. Some people can't ask a question or clarify a point or ask for evidence without being argumentative, and that does not bode well for interdisciplinary teamwork. So we need to keep in mind that clinicians are much more effective if they can find common ground and values with their clients and coworkers. The last point we can make is that when we ask questions, we need to think critically about the issue at hand. So here are some questions or some things to think about that will help us to figure out the value and the logic behind research in general. So first, we need to be able to identify the issues, conclusions, and the reasons presented to us in research or in our clinical practice. We need to figure out if there are any ambiguous words or phrases, or if the person or the entity or organization is presenting the information to us in a way that is biased somehow. We also want to be able to evaluate the quality of the evidence and how thorough the information is. So we can ask ourselves, is the argument a good one based on sound logic and facts? Has any detail been omitted? And so you have to think about all of these questions as you begin to examine research studies and the clinical practices that you may be observing more thoroughly. So these questions, we will be covering them throughout these chapters in the Browne and Keeley book, but these questions are going to form the basis of your research project later on in this course, and it's going to help you to be a better, more engaged clinician in your placements and in your career.